Hello and welcome to another video trying to get you the very top grade 7 and above using just one quotation to fit every single possible question and every possible theme on Macbeth. We begin with, "Come to my woman's breasts and take my milk for gall, you murdering ministers," from Lady Macbeth as she prepares herself to plan the killing of Duncan. And my plan is to link this to all the 10 possible essay topics that can come up and to the 4 overarching themes. There are many themes on Macbeth, but they're all sucked into these 4. So let's begin with the Patriarchal Society. As you know, this is a society controlled by men for their own benefit. Now we can instantly see that Lady Macbeth wishes to assume power in a patriarchal society, and to do that she has to de-feminize herself. She actually takes the symbols of her femininity and also of her motherhood and gets the femininity entirely removed and her ability to be a mother removed. So the milk is removed from the breasts, but worse than that, it is replaced by gall, a poison. So if you want to show that Lady Macbeth represents the evils of womankind, you can show how she replaces the softness of motherhood with the idea of poison, so that any child she brings up will be poisoned and evil like her. But if you want to show that society is evil because it is patriarchal, then you want to point out that the only way Lady Macbeth can try to get some power in this society is to become evil and to become masculine. Women are forbidden power, so she attacks the symbols of her womanhood, the breasts, and the symbols of motherhood, her main role in society, the breast milk. In other words, she takes away everything that makes her female in the patriarchal society in order that she can become male and achieve power. Now Shakespeare would therefore be deeply critical of a society that forces its women to do this, and you can also see that in the creation of the weird sisters, the witches. They are also forced to achieve power because they're ugly and they can't achieve it in the conventional sense through marriage, and so they are forced to turn to witchcraft and spell making to try and get any sort of identity and power in this patriarchal society. Or we can take the Christian interpretation. The Christian interpretation will argue that it is entirely Lady Macbeth's fault that she chooses evil. She asks for the assistance of murdering ministers, and she's picking here a religious word. So a minister would be somebody connected to the church who would help. But here she's taking that religious language and inverting it and creating murdering ministers. In this way she deliberately seeks the power of the witches, she seeks the power of evil, she seeks the power of Satan, if you like, and from a Christian perspective, she entirely deserves to go to hell from this moment, even before she plans the killing of Duncan. But simply by transferring her allegiance from God to the murdering ministers, these agents of the supernatural, she deserves to go to hell. Then the imagery conveys how unnatural this act is, because it takes her breast milk and changes her substantially and physically into something else, and that is a crime against nature. That's a theme that keeps cropping up during the play, as we see, especially when Duncan is killed, and that's the ultimate crime against nature because it goes against the great chain of being. And in case you haven't seen my videos, this is what the great chain of being looks like. It places God at the top of the natural hierarchy, followed by the angels, followed by the church, symbolized by the Pope, and then the kings and queens who are appointed divinely by God's judgment. Therefore, Lady Macbeth's plan to assassinate Duncan is a crime against the natural order, which is dictated by God and the great chain of being. So this is again an unchristian, fundamentally unchristian act, because it attacks God directly rather than the simple killing of any normal human being. They have picked on the symbol of God's ultimate power on earth, the king. And so from that moment, divine punishment is inevitable. The other big theme of any tragedy is the notion of fate, and the question whether we can change our own fates and choose our destiny, or whether they are set for us. Well, we can see quite clearly in Shakespeare's language here that she is making a completely independent choice. She is using the imperative verb to summon the murdering ministers. She is choosing how they're going to help her by corrupting her breast milk and turning it into gall, into poison. In this way, Shakespeare is presenting her decision as entirely her own. It is an act of free will which she did not have to make, and she could have just simply waited for this fate of her becoming queen to arise in the natural order. But instead, she turns immediately to murder and chooses from this moment her own damnation. So we've already covered Lady Macbeth and the supernatural and the link to Duncan. Now let's look at Macbeth. Well, Macbeth has written the letter to his wife that prompts her to request this supernatural help, and I'd like to argue that he sends her that letter on purpose, knowing that she will come up with a plan, because you remember her words about him, that she fears he is too full of the milk of human kindness. And that's another reason she gets rid of the breast milk in this imagery. She wants to get rid of her own kindness, but also it links directly to her husband's. She has to become evil in order to make her husband evil enough to kill Duncan. Macbeth desperately wants to kill Duncan himself, but we know he can't face doing it. Therefore, he writes to Lady Macbeth in the knowledge that she will come up with a plan to do it. That's what I'd like to argue here. And so Lady Macbeth isn't responsible for Macbeth's tragedy here. He uses her, he manipulates her, knowing that she will try and find a way to persuade him, to give him that spur that he talks about, the spur to prick his intent, that's going to make him finally decide to kill Duncan. Now, the grade 9 idea I'd like you to hold on to here is that Lady Macbeth has just lost her child. We know it's recent because she is still producing breast milk, and she says to Macbeth when he refuses to kill Duncan that he should know that she knows the pain of losing a child, and yet she would rather dash out the brains of her own child than break a promise. And so she deliberately fixes on this psychological, this terribly painful moment when she references the death of their child. It's something that the Macbeths skirt around. The grief of it is obviously too raw, but Shakespeare introduces it to give us a psychological reason why both Lady Macbeth and Macbeth would turn to this idea of murder. It's a way for them to fill up the child-size hole in their heart, if you like. The only way they can compensate for this great loss is to imagine getting what they hope is a greater prize, becoming king and queen. We can now easily talk about Lady Macbeth's feelings of guilt because she's gone against the Christian morality of the time and also the morality of her own gender. She's attacked her very femininity. Now, what's interesting, once Macbeth has murdered Duncan, they no longer sleep together, and we can see this by the fact that Macbeth brings in a doctor and tells the doctor that he has not seen Lady Macbeth sleepwalking. It's been reported to him by her maid, her waiting woman. So here Shakespeare clearly indicates that they cease to have a normal marriage. They're no longer having sex together. They're no longer sleeping together. They are living lives apart. And so ironically, her desire to be made less a woman works, and this makes her far less attractive to her husband. So we could argue the tragedy is that in giving her husband the power to kill Duncan, she has also poisoned him with her gall, and he no longer finds her in any way attractive. Their marriage dies at the same time as Duncan does. We dealt with the idea of power when we talked about the patriarchy and also the great chain of being. We now need to consider how the idea of kingship is exposed through this quotation. Well, it suggests that in order to become queen, she feels she needs to become a non-woman. We might say that's the same as becoming a man. And this is a political reference to Queen Elizabeth I, who famously portrayed herself as the Virgin Queen. She couldn't indulge in sexuality because she needed to save herself for her country. Another way of interpreting that propaganda is to say that Queen Elizabeth had to become manly in order to rule. And Lady Macbeth is still picking up on the context of Shakespeare's day and saying that in order for her to become queen, she has to become ruthless and manly. Now, if we interpret it that way, she comes across as the more dominant partner. This is Queen Elizabeth we're talking about, who ruled as the queen without a king. And so this masculine metaphor here suggests that Lady Macbeth sees herself as the more important partner in the marriage, as the more powerful partner in the marriage, and therefore she wants to seize control, with Macbeth being subservient to her. That again would go against the natural order. Macbeth, in terms of the hierarchy of the day, ought to become king in this patriarchal society, and therefore her interference is seen as something again attacking the natural order, and that's why she appears to suffer more than Macbeth does, and where he is able to die in battle, she ends up turning to suicide, taking her sense of guilt and turning it upon herself, because her crimes are seen as worse than Macbeth's, because she initiated the plan, as we see in this very quotation. Now, interestingly, when Macbeth decides to kill Banquo, he does not confide in his wife. This suggests that Macbeth fears Lady Macbeth's desire to become evil and to become strong and powerful like a man has failed. He suspects that she's still too kind, perhaps has too much milk, to justify the killing of Banquo, Macbeth's friend. He fears perhaps that she would counsel against it. And part of the evidence he has of that, of course, is that Lady Macbeth did not kill Duncan as she promised. She tells Macbeth that she would have killed him had he not resembled my father as he slept. And that reveals her womanly nature, the milk of her human kindness. So, yes, she served her purpose in persuading Macbeth to kill Duncan, but Macbeth realizes she is not evil enough for the kind of decisions he feels he needs to make. So in that reading, her suicide isn't a greater punishment. It is a recognition that she was more female, if you like, and therefore more weak, and psychologically more weak than Macbeth, because she feels guilt and remorse. So if we go back to the Patriarchal Society, it suggests that because she is a woman, she is not able to behave in these masculine ways, because women are ultimately still psychologically weaker than men. And another way that Shakespeare reinforces the Patriarchal Society is by making her suicide happen off stage. We don't even get to see it, and Macbeth doesn't even go and visit her body. So it appears as though she becomes less and less significant as society writes her out of history in a way, in the same way that women are written out of power. Now, an interesting discussion for your essay is whether Shakespeare is in agreement with that patriarchal view, or whether he creates Lady Macbeth to show he is in disagreement with it, and he uses the portrayal of Lady Macbeth to show how damaging it is to take a powerful woman and then deny her any kind of power or influence. Now we can also link that to Macduff, because we see that before she commits suicide, she starts worrying about the Thane of Fife had a wife, in other words Macduff's wife, who Macbeth has had murdered. So we can see again the milk of her human kindness there, where she would have counselled Macbeth against killing Macduff's family, which is why he keeps apart from her and no longer seeks her counsel. And then finally, in the killing of Duncan, we've already seen how that is seen as an unnatural act, a crime against nature, because it goes against the great chain of being. And this is echoed in her prayer, if you like, her command here, where she demands that her nature is changed. So there you have it. You will be able to use this quotation in any single essay that you can possibly be given on Macbeth. As you know, there's going to be 10 of them in this series. Do subscribe if you want to get them all. Give me your comments below if you've got ways for me to improve them. See you soon on my channel.